Thank you so much. All right, it's now my very great and sincere pleasure to be able to introduce our keynote speaker for this conference, Adriana Diaz. Adriana Diaz is a lecturer in Spanish and Latin American Studies at the University of Queensland School of Languages and Cultures. Her research is rooted in the area of intercultural language education, and her book, Developing Critical Language-Culture Pedagogies in Higher Education, Theory and Practice from 2013, I think is a must-read for those of us who are concerned with these intersections of intercultural learning and modern language education. She's particularly interested in how critical pedagogy and decolonial critique can help us to and relearn the ways in which we engage with language education. And in addition to the monograph that I previously mentioned and many articles on the subject, together with Maria Dasley, she co-edited a 2017 volume, The Critical Turn in Language and Intercultural Communication Pedagogy, which is a really inspiring collection of perspectives in this area of research. Her most recent research directly bears on the topic of this conference by examining the global imaginaries underpinning modern universities' internationalization processes and their impact on the provision of languages education. So today she'll be sharing with us some of this work in her talk, The Invisibility of Languages and Universities' Internationalization Processes. Please join me in welcoming Adriana Diaz.
Alrighty. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Beatrice and Chantal. I am honored to be here with you today and for this invitation. So I would like to start the presentation by posing a question. Do you recall the exact moment in which you realized that languages, the subject matter of your teaching, of your research, of your free time, what you dedicate your life to, is not neutral or innocent? This is not an innocent subject of study, but rather one that can be commodified and even weaponized. What about the moment in which you realized your unconscious complicity in making it so? I can tell you that in my case, even though I have had glimpses of this over many years, it really is a realization that has only started to crystallize in the last few years. Significantly leading to this year, the year 2020, which marks the 20th anniversary or year anniversary of my arrival in Australia. I arrived in Brisbane as an international student, and I feel that that was the moment I started to become part of the fabric of the modern internationalized university. So this is a picture of that time, summer of the year 2000, start of the new millennium, perhaps the year in which some of you were born, maybe, that I feel marked the start of my journey engaging in the academic world through languages. So what took me to Australia was my passion for languages. Having graduated as a kindergarten and primary school teacher of English back home in Argentina, I started my undergraduate studies in languages and applied linguistics with the plan to return home, having improved my level of English language proficiency and having added a major in Italian and having dabbled a little bit in Japanese languages studies as well. So you can definitely say that languages are my passion, and they represent, for me, the lens through which I engage with the internationalization literature. I believe it is a lens that remains under-researched in the literature, and I hope to share and discuss with you some emerging ideas across disciplines, from higher education studies to the philosophy of education, and various branches of applied linguistics, including languages education. I believe all of these disciplines and fields are trying to bring languages as one of the many meaning-making tools, which is unique in its potential to encode a pluriversity of epistemologies and ontologies into processes to do with internationalization as we know it. I think at this point it is important to acknowledge, again, the unavoidable difficulty, and citing Sharon's work, the circularity of engaging with languages or with the languages lens through language itself and through English in particular. The way we talk about languages is not neutral. The labels that we use to qualify languages, foreign, heritage, community, and even world languages as well, are not neutral. Also the way we refer to their speakers, native, non-native, near-native, emerging bilinguals. This language carries a lot of meaning, and we often neglect to acknowledge this as the basis through which we conduct our practice. And to complicate matters a little bit more, generally speaking, when we talk and think about languages in higher education and various internationalization processes, there is a complete erasure of certain languages and language varieties, such as stigmatized varieties of English, indigenous languages, sign languages, and other means of communication. Now, my research interest, given the current context in which I have been studying and working over the past 20 years, is on universities located in the Anglophone Centre, the US, the UK, and Australia in particular, as the top 3 countries attracting more than 50% of the international student population worldwide. These hypermobile and in some cases highly privileged students are attracted, like I was, by the desire and aspiration to acquire English as a social and professional capital. But interestingly, it is in these predominantly English-speaking countries that monolingualism is prevalent, and where reportedly the study of languages other than English is in a permanent state of crisis. This can be observed, for instance, in the UK with the effects of Brexit, influencing the steep decline in the study of languages across sectors. This state of crisis, however, has in turn been exacerbated by internal forces within the field of applied linguistics and its many branches. These forces have been driven by scholarly criticism and manifested in so-called turns, the multilingual turn being one of the most recent ones. These turns have led us to challenging key, taken for granted conceptualizations of languages as separate, homogeneously standardized, bounded objects, unproblematically linked to culture, race, ethnicity, and the nation state. As a result, renewed understandings of languages from a post-structural perspective as occurring at the intersection of ideology and individual agency has been gaining traction. Against this backdrop, I believe that translanguaging, as conceptualized by Garcia and Lee in particular, has much to offer. They conceive of translanguaging as transcending the linguistic dimension of socially constructed name languages. In other words, when I talk about the linguistic dimension here, I refer to lexicon, morphology, phonology, syntax, and they do this in order to incorporate other modes of meaning-making, which may include our bodies, gestures, lived experiences, and thus conceiving of a more holistic communicative repertoire. So as a collective, we have only just begun addressing the growing complexities of the current multilingual and translingual landscape approaches to its research and also the pedagogical implications in the classroom. So, on the one hand, we have a field standing on shifting grounds, and on the other, ever more aggressive, epistemologically violent processes of internationalization whose engagement with languages and linguistic diversity remains highly problematic and largely under-researched. So in this presentation, I would like to explore and attempt to chart this complex landscape together in order to untangle and uncover the mechanisms that enable this state of play. So here we may ask ourselves, what are the mechanisms that enable certain languages to be seen and to be heard in predominantly Anglophone universities? But also, what are the mechanisms that enable and perpetuate the policing of the presence of and interactions in languages other than English in today's hyper-diverse university campuses? So when I talk about policing here, I refer policing of languages other than English, I refer to the anecdotal but also highly public examples of international students being openly discouraged to speak in their own mother tongue by academic and professional staff. So we know that the mainstream literature and internationalization processes certainly discusses the development of intercultural competence and linguistic competence. However, the relationship between these two is rarely addressed. When it is typically manifested through utilitarian neoliberal discourses of career advancement and employability. And again, here I acknowledge my complicity in doing so as well. Sometimes some of the vulnerable languages programs rely on these discourses to survive, to keep a job, to keep going. So as we have heard from other presenters, key drivers in universities' internationalization agendas focus on encouraging and even celebrating student mobility, staff mobility, offshore delivery of courses, and so on. On campus, these strategies have resulted in an increasingly diverse linguistic, racial, and socioeconomic profile of both individuals and groups of academics, administrative staff, and students in general. So while this may potentially create fruitful conditions for an ongoing diversification of universities' linguistic ecologies and richer onto-epistemological ecologies, as Lidicott points out, in most cases, universities have largely responded to these phenomena in terms of business as usual. As such, paradoxically, despite the ostensibly super diverse multilingual environment in which these actors, in which we are all immersed, approaches to internationalization can be seen as an instance of a monolingual habitus that constructs internationalization as something that occurs mainly through a single language and requires only knowledge of that language for full participation in the internationalized academy. Here, internationalized universities are positioned as major interlocutors in the knowledge economy. They contribute to the reconfiguration, reproduction, and redistribution and application of knowledge. In this context, knowledge at university level is conceived as a commodity to be traded for economic prosperity, where knowledge products and highly educated personnel contribute to economic growth. However, rather than promoting equal flows in knowledge, equally benefiting various stakeholders and society at large, this model of knowledge-driven prosperity and growth tends to flow into already dominant key players, thus maintaining their linguistic and epistemic dominance. Indeed, in the case of predominantly Anglophone universities, the domination of Western epistemic perspectives both affirms and perpetuates a monolingual and monocultural Eurocentric model of knowledge production. This is achieved through at least three types of mechanisms: through the transmission of knowledge, through English as the main medium of instruction, the production and reproduction of knowledge, for instance, through postgraduate doctoral programs which value monocultural, Eurocentric epistemic perspectives and models of scientific engagement and how we should conduct research. And the monolingual linguistic hegemony of English in the dissemination of knowledge through scholarly publications, the kind of language that is valued by universities. Are my publications in Spanish valued the same way as the ones in English? How can this issue be addressed? Well, institutions and individuals can approach this from the top down, with institution-wide policies addressing various dimensions of staff and student experience on campus, or from the bottom up, exploring matters at the classroom level, and of course from both perspectives. So what university mission statements and internationalization strategy documents tell us regarding the top-down approaches is that they tend to look at linguistic diversity as something being imported, brought to us by the international student body. They diversify and multilingualize us and our campuses. For local or home students, engagement with diversity and the development of multilingualism can mainly be achieved through, in some cases, vulnerable world languages programs or away from campus by going overseas on exchange. These unidirectional ways of engaging with languages and linguistic diversity is represented here. And against this backdrop, both international and domestic or home students appear to be homogeneously conceptualized. And in both cases, there is a language as a deficit problem that needs to be resolved, rather than a language as a resource to be equally celebrated. On the one hand, in the case of international students, the focus is on the perceived deficiencies in the English language, with funding being allocated to addressing that perceived gap. On the other, in the case of home and domestic students, there is the problem of language studies uptake. This is the case in Australia in particular, as language study is not a compulsory component of university degrees. So this problem within that dominant neoliberal internationalization imaginary ultimately renders these local students less competitive. So we need to do something about that problem too. So going back to the description of the super diverse multilingual campuses in which we operate, we must consider whose multilingualism is being encouraged and celebrated, and in relation to what languages. Ideologies underpinning multilingualism and the way it's being co-opted by universities and language education specialists have only just started to be explored. And I think last year in particular was prolific in terms of the number of publications addressing the complexities of multilingualism and its underpinning ideologies. This research is challenging the current hegemonic, epistemologically imbalanced, monolingualizing ideologies in higher education, and I think it's gaining momentum. Let me give you some examples from the Australian context. So here we have a number of publications, and some studies have emerged here which point to the inequalities of access to languages education at the top here. Oh, sorry, here. Access to languages other than English as an educational pipeline. So this has to do with access to languages in rural schools and rural universities as well. We also have studies that have started to map language hierarchies on campus, such as this one. What are, in this hyper-diverse, linguistically diverse campus, what are the language hierarchies that are lying behind this diversity? They've also, in this particular project, they've explored university language policies that focus only on English, despite the reality that we were discussing. So interest around the way in which languages other than English are promoted and their obscure relationship with the development of global graduates in university mission statements has also been started to explore. So we have here a discourse analytic approach to university mission statements and how they relate internationalization, the development of global competence, and language. How do we market our languages? Is the way in which we market our languages complicit with these ideologies that I was discussing earlier? So another interesting thing that's emerging from the Australian context is that when it comes to engagement with translingual approaches to learning, and translingual in the vein of the work done by Garcia and Lee, these have mainly focused on discipline-specific content courses taught through English as a medium of instruction, rather than in so-called languages program. So translingualism hasn't reached the World Languages Program, or the languages program, as we call them in Australia. So this is an interesting development, I think. What we're also starting to see is examples of what Sharon discussed yesterday. that is, gestures that move away from minor and major internationalization reform thinking in the teaching of languages through a decolonial lens. Here we find Alison Phipps's work at the intersect of academic and creative writing, in which she incorporates her own poetry in order to consider how multilingualism, rather than dismantling, may actually allow colonial legacies to endure. Donaldo Macedo's edited volume provides insightful rationalizations around how and why language teaching, language teacher education, and applied linguistics may benefit from a decolonial approach. And here we also have the collaboration between two critical applied linguistic scholars, Portuguese Manuela Guilherme, right here in the middle, and Brazilian Lin-Mario Menezes de Souza. They are concerned with global South perspectives around critical intercultural awareness, and in their volume they examine local languages which have been successfully globalized. They focus on European languages recreated in Latin America, English, Spanish, and Portuguese, along with other languages underexplored in the literature, including indigenous languages such as Guarani. They use this exploration as the basis for countering hegemonic theories of globalization in our field. And the last two books here in this slide, we see these two co-authored books representing the collaboration spanning quite a few years from 2005, McConey and Alistair Pennycook publication of their seminal book in the discussion, which discusses languages as social inventions, heavily influenced by racial and nationalist ideologies. And we move to their last or most recent publication, where they develop alternative understandings of applied linguistics to expand the intellectual repertoires of the discipline, and in so doing, challenge the complicities between applied linguistics, colonialism, and capitalism. Another example is the recently launched journal Language, Culture and Society, in which the editors dedicated the forum section in its first issue to exploring alternative indigenous understandings of geography, time, politics, and ethics, which disrupt the normalized ontologies and epistemologies of Western modernity. I highly recommend having a look at these papers too. But what happens beyond the Anglophone Centre? So while the role of languages in internationalization processes is seldom acknowledged in language policies of universities in these countries, this may be contrasted with jurisdictions in which the majority of the population's first language is not English, and where English as a medium of instruction, or EMI, has been adopted. So here are two examples from the literature which explore the possibilities of multilingual and translingual approaches to higher education. The second volume in particular provides case studies from universities in South Africa, Denmark, Ukraine, India, and the United Arab Emirates. All of these case studies demonstrate how the use of translanguaging practices within the context of global higher education has the potential to disrupt monolingual ideologies as multilingual students, professors, class materials, and policies come together and build their linguistic repertoires to facilitate meaning making. More recently, we have this example from Emma and Ute in Europe. They introduce what they call road mapping, the road mapping framework for English medium education in multilingual university settings. And I think we can explore this as well as something that may be applied in other contexts. They use this framework as a holistic approach to undertake contextualized research and engage management in their universities to engage with these issues. So the multi-layered framework that you see here consists of six intersecting yet independent dimensions which are accessible through the discourses available at this university. So the road mapping comes from the roles of English, academic disciplines, language management, agents, practices and processes, and internationalization and localization. So what are the discourses mobilized at these universities? How are they interacting? Can they help us get a better picture of what's going on and what can be improved? Case studies in the volume are drawn from universities in Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and South America. Okay, so we've talked about the Anglophone countries, we've talked about beyond the Anglophone countries. Where to from here? This image represents our standing at the edge of an abyss. The not known and not yet knowable kinds of practices that lie beyond what we have unconsciously and systematically acquired. For me, this image evokes the need to engage with post-abyssal thinking as defined by Global South scholar Sosa Santos. Indeed, this scholar and many colleagues in the Global South are engaging with and complementing the research emerging from applied linguistics and languages education to apply a decolonial approach to internationalization, one that can illuminate alternative pathways of engagement beyond reform. Perhaps one clear example of what this might look like, also from the Australian context, has to do with knowledge making conceived within postmonolingual doctoral supervision. So I've talked a lot about languages education, but as you know, many tenured language teacher researchers are called upon to supervise students from a variety of linguistic and cultural backgrounds, sometimes because of and sometimes in spite of their primary area of expertise in a given language and culture. So this is another aspect I believe remains under research in terms of how the knowledge economy or the type of knowledge economy deliberately mobilized by universities is affecting our colleagues. It is also here the reformulation and dissemination of original contributions. What is considered original contribution in doctoral supervision that happens from a postmonolingual perspective? One that engages knowledges that are beyond the Western-centric or Eurocentric tradition. Recognition of the theoretical and linguistic divergence of Indigenous and non-Western doctoral students as a strength rather than as a deficit has emerged as a key aspect in redressing the potential for unique knowledge creation and co-creation that characterizes this aspect of the university. So, we talked a lot about the bottom, the top-down. What about the bottom-up perspective? What does this all mean for in-classroom student-facing practices? Many presentations at the conference are tackling this head-on, I believe. They're proposing pedagogical interventions that foreground the role of languages and languaging in the development of intercultural competence and critical awareness around onto-epistemological perspectives within their specific, situated institutional constraints. These interventions actively engage us with reframing existing practice to create transformative ones. However, we must continue to interrogate these pedagogical interventions and the very research questions that we might formulate around them in order to dismantle our own understandings as well as social, ethical, and onto-epistemological conceptions of language. We cannot underestimate the resilience of monoglossic ideologies underpinning our own engagement as well as our students' engagement with the languages classroom as we know it. So we're not only dealing with our own, but also the expectations that students have when they cross the classroom threshold. We also cannot underestimate the vested interests in maintaining the status quo. Other stakeholders might resist this. Maybe stakeholders such as textbook publishers, and language proficiency testing centers. So as Garcia and Otegui observe in a recent publication which is included in my handout, foreign language education programs continue to reinforce the construction of what they call named languages as spoken in specified foreign nation states. The idea being that learning of this language will contribute to increased communication between people from discrete countries. We have to push against the resilient boundaries of these current imaginaries, the systemic internalized ways of thinking about languages and languages, which ultimately perpetuate separation and exclusion in order to think from the perspective, from the unthought, from the yet-to-be-imagined pedagogies. We need to reflect on how all these aspects might be limiting the way in which we interrogate our own teaching and research practices. So some questions that come to mind for me are, who benefits from commodified versions of multilingualism in the modern internationalized university? How might institution-wide policies, language policies help promote more equitable approaches to multilingualism? Whose linguistics repertoires are included and excluded in these policies? How might staff and students be encouraged to draw on their linguistic repertoires and meaning-making repertoires in general to challenge dominant epistemologies, traditional models of knowledge transmission, production, and dissemination reproduced by universities around the world? Ultimately, a reduction of language diversity is directly related to a reduction in epistemic diversity and biodiversity, which can effectively lead to a kind of linguistically mediated epistemicide. Indigenous knowledges, for example, encoded in language, are concerned with the protection of all ways of life, not just human beings, but also the non-human, animals, plants, rivers, and the land. Linguistic diversity is just as important as other types of biodiversity within this ecosystem. So what might this polyphonic university look like? Maybe a place where linguistic diversity is considered as part of the biodiversity of the world. A key step in this direction is acknowledging and engaging with the deep, non-hierarchical interrelatedness of languaging practices and onto epistemological practices, that is, ways of knowing and being that surround us. Overlooking this entanglement can have tragic consequences beyond the anthropocentric realm. A present example of such devastating consequences can be observed in the ongoing fire crisis engulfing much of Australia, which, along with the traumatic loss of human lives, has also affected the non-human realm, decimating native food sources, burning through ancient trees, and destroying ancestral and totemic plants and animals. It is difficult to fathom the kinds of indigenous knowledges that have been lost through colonially led linguicide and ongoing epistemicide knowledges which may have aided in sustainably managing the land otherwise. Indeed, according to Joe Morrison, the CEO of the Northern Land Council for Indigenous Australians, fire is and always has been part of the interwoven matrix of the relationships between people and the physical and spiritual world. The smell of smoke is expected to be in the air for half a year. Yet, since colonization, many Indigenous people have been removed from their land, and the cultural fire management practices have been constrained by authorities informed by Western views of fire and land management. In fact, he states, current responses to managing fire are largely built around events in the calendar. By contrast, Indigenous knowledge and management is responsive to the changes in the country, regardless of the month. So in this way, for Australian Indigenous people, settler colonialism is not a historical event, but an ongoing, grief-ridden, lived experience. I don't know if there are any words in any language that can accurately describe the current mourning. I would like here to cite Alison Phipps's work. She says, and I quote, "Faced with the impossibility of working in a vacuum and with overwhelming evidence of our interconnectedness and interdependence, perhaps one of the ways in which the dominance of English and the dominance of human speech might be disrupted and transformed is through listening to the land again. End quote. In this presentation, I have raised several questions. Many of these questions require individual reflection. Others require collaborative attention to find solutions that may effect transformative change. I envisage this collaboration taking place as a critically collective professional body within languages and intercultural studies, but more importantly, through generative, transdisciplinary conversations with fields such as critical internationalization studies, philosophy, and linguistic anthropology. This may enable us to harness complementary linkages among these fields, and in so doing, develop more nuanced, context-sensitive theorizations, analytical and methodological frameworks through which to teach and conduct research through a languaging lens. But we cannot do this work alone, and I am really, truly grateful to have learned so much already from many of you in the audience who are leading the way in tackling these matters within and beyond the classroom walls. But beyond the possibility of actual institution-wide policy reform and classroom innovation, I believe that the key remains being able to hold a safe space in which we can help promote and scaffold the adoption of a humble, critical, reflective stance through which, as teachers and learners, we can contest, reimagine, and attempt to enact this critical engagement, whatever shape or form they may take. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow, maybe not every day. In so doing, we must continue to remind ourselves of the limits of critique, its imperfect, discomforting, and even painful nature. And it's something, as I said, I am complicit with. It's not every day that I manage to incorporate these ideas in the classroom, and certainly not within the constraints of the course outlines and assessment practices that we are expected to implement at university. So I would like to thank you all wholeheartedly for listening and for engaging in these ongoing reflections with me today. I know that I have not offered any specific solutions, but as we discussed yesterday, we must resist the allure of ready-made, guaranteed solutions. Instead, I hope that some of the questions that I pose stay with you, and that as multi-species feminist theorist Donna Haraway says, that you stay with the trouble, all while you articulate your own approach to enhancing the critical role of languages and languaging on the internationalized campus and your own practice as lifelong language learners, teachers, and researchers. Thank you.
Thank you so much for challenging us to think of our own positionalities and implications in the multilingual, multicultural world. We now have about 15 minutes. My colleague Kokshin and I will be facilitating a question and answer period. Also, if you are joining us from the live stream, hello. I'll be checking the comments if you would like to ask a question digitally.
So much for this talk. I'm going to ask you to do exactly what you just told us you didn't do,
okay,
which is a little unfair, and I admit.
Okay.
But I'm wondering if you can just give us some examples of how you stay with the trouble in your everyday practice as a language educator and as a person who's engaged with students and with curriculum at an institution of higher education.
Thank you, Chantal. Should I repeat that question? Yes. So Chantal's question was, how do I manage to stay with the trouble in my practice? I think it's something that is certainly difficult to do because we're not alone. We work in teams of teachers. And one of the difficulties at times is having everyone on that same page and not imposing on them that they stay with the trouble too. This is something that I encourage and I suggest, but it cannot be within that frame something that I also impose on my teachers. So sometimes it's hard to know what's happening in their classroom behind closed doors, so I have to trust that the sorts of discussions that we have make it to the classroom. But I have to acknowledge that one of the difficulties is making sure that everyone is on the same page when we work together. Inside the classroom, for me, is listening to the students, sometimes being more open to what they have to say and their opinions. One of the very specific ways in which this is changing my curriculum right now is the way we use inclusive language in Spanish, which is a very difficult and controversial topic, which again is supported by all of these frames, colonial frames around the way we think about languages from the Royal Academy of Languages, of Spanish language, sorry. So it's something that we have to resist even when students pose these questions. We know that pronouns are very important, so how do we manage that? So that's a very specific linguistically mediated way in which we need to really think what we do from the moment we start addressing our students even.
Any other questions?
Thank you very much for your inspiring presentation. I'm from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, and we teach content-based instruction courses. Every student has a world language of study, but now there is a new policy in place that is supposed to be implemented, which is going to make the language requirement more flexible. So it seems to me that if we view the internationalization process as having two components, both intercultural competence and linguistic competence, do you believe that as part of this hegemonic monoglottic ideology that the monolingual intercultural competence may take over or is taking over linguistic competence and mastery in world languages? And do you believe that if this trend is happening, do you believe that it may gain even more momentum in the near future?
Yes, thank you for your question. So I need to summarize it for the audience, and I don't know if I'll be able to do it justice, but what are the effects of these monolingual ways in which we conceptualize intercultural competence, and what are the effects for world languages as well? So I definitely think that is a trend, and one of the biggest problems I see is a lot of the publications in communication studies, they only touch upon languages as one very little variable in the work that they do. They do not look at languages or translanguaging as potential ways of meaning making in the classroom. So that whole literature, that whole discipline we're not in conversation yet with them. So that's one big problem. I certainly think this is the tendency for intercultural competence to be conceptualized from a monolingual English perspective. For the world languages classroom, I think critical language awareness is the kind of concept or notions that we have been drawing upon, but I think language policies at universities are making these harder and harder for students to access. I don't know whether institution-wide language policies, what effect we might have, if we can lobby or we can do anything when so many departments are vulnerable and being closed down. So certainly I hope that we are listened to at some point in order to ensure that there's a diversification in the way we conceptualize of intercultural competence. Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question about translanguaging in the language classroom.
Yes.
Do you have, I work with new teachers and things like that. Do you have recommendations on how multiple languages are best used in a language classroom while also maintaining the acquisition of language as a main goal?
Yes, I think this, going back to the literature that I reviewed, I think this is one of the main challenges that world languages teachers face when it comes to incorporating a translanguaging approach. I think it's quite different from bilingual education where it originally emerged, and certainly the reality in Australia is not the same as the US, in which this literature emerged from. So what might be some ways of doing this is, I believe, changing the way in which we think about the language classroom. And I know by calling it a language classroom, we're already using language that may constrain the way in which these educators or future educators look at what they do. But I think it's a conversation that needs to be engaged. What is a language? What is a language? Can we communicate without a language in the first place? There are other meaning-making ways that we can draw from. So unpacking those ideologies, I think it would be a first step. And I think in any language program, the first step is also to discuss that openly with the students, because they need to understand that the target language, or acquiring the target language, becoming a native speaker, having a teacher that is a non-native speaker, what sorts of questions are they already coming up with are reflective of ideologies. Or I prefer to have a teacher from South America, or I prefer to have a Spanish teacher that is from Spain because she speaks real Spanish, or what is real Spanish? So these sorts of questions, perhaps if addressed from the beginning, they can help. And I'm not saying that they're the solution, but I think they can help open a dialogue around that.
I work in multilingual classrooms preparing students to go into healthcare. And I've read a lot about the multilingual crisis in Australian nursing and the issues of cultural humility and the problems of cultural competence, those two concepts in healthcare. What kind of parallels or differences do you see between the approaches to multilingualism in the university versus the institution of multicultural healthcare within the parameters that you've been discussing?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. So just to repeat it for the audience online, so what parallels do I draw between the discussion and what's happening at institutional level within healthcare in Australia and maybe other multilingual healthcare settings? Well, very difficult question. But I think one of the things that is a challenge, again, is to value the different knowledges that come with these healthcare practitioners or future healthcare practitioners, and the inability for us to see other ways of conducting healthcare that are manifested, yes, through language, but at the intercultural level that you're talking about, I think is acknowledging and valuing that kind of knowledge that they bring with them. And that's something that we can draw a parallel with in the classroom, certainly. The way in which certain knowledges are ignored and languages are erased from that conversation. Yeah. Hope that answers your question, maybe a little bit. Thank you.
We might have time for one final question, if there's anybody willing to.
Thank you so much. I think you're talking to those of us who are mostly bilingual or multilingual. And I think the challenge that I find is, and I am a member of CIATAR and have been for 50 years, but how do I talk to my interculturalist colleagues who are so often monolingual, especially in North America, and get them to understand, if they have never grappled with another language or learned to any degree of proficiency, the importance of what we're all about in trying to connect this linguistic competence to the intercultural competence, which is one of the reasons that I insist on calling it intercultural communicative competence. And I just wonder how you and all of us in our institutions deal with our monolingual colleagues.
Yes, I completely agree. I think it goes back to that comment that I made about the discipline of communication studies and intercultural communication studies that is highly monolingual, and it produces and reproduces monolingualism in many ways. So how do we do that? How do we engage with these colleagues? I think that one way is to continue the work that we're doing, engaging with other disciplines, bringing in other disciplines into the conversation. I think that it's a question of time, possibly, for them to really open their eyes to the fact that there are other ways of knowing and being in the world, and that language manifests some of those ways. I think it's a really tough challenge that we have, and I mean, it hasn't been resolved for decades, so it's something that it's an ongoing, I think, task for us to continue to face. And I think the work that you're doing is fantastic, and we can only hope that, you know, collectively, we can all have something to contribute to that conversation.
So thank you so much again. I'm sure we all definitely appreciated your talk. If you loved the talk, which I'm sure you did, if you will please use the Whova app to click on this session and rate it. This is helpful for not only us as a conference in improving, but also for securing hopeful grant applications in the future. Finally, if you are hungry, lunch is on the way. It will be in the Kiva Ballroom, which if you're unsure of where that is, go this way, and I'm sure you'll see a mass of people headed that way, so just follow them. Again, thank you.